Well, I think, Edward, I think we are in a more severe security environment that's creating more geopolitical risks than has existed in the past, and that's on multiple levels. I think we're seeing it, certainly the potential risk of major conflict, which would have profound implications throughout the world in the region. Below that, though, I think there are potential for significant crises that wouldn't necessarily be full-blown conflict, but could still have quite significant effects on the free flow of commerce and energy and supply chains and whatnot. And then finally has been something I think we've all been watching, which has been really the integration of security and economics as one and the same, and the degree to which governments around the world, in Washington, in Beijing, throughout the region, are putting in place policies and controls that are reshaping the global economy. Well, I think there's an underestimation happening. It may be separate from what you might be expecting. I think there is a case to be made that businesses should be thinking about some degree of redundancy and resilience associated with their supply chains.
Absolutely.
That being said, Taiwan is such an important part of the international economy, and for countries really throughout the world, but including in the region, that I guess what I have underestimated, what I see the private sector underestimating, is the degree to which they have a role in ensuring the maintenance of peace and security and stability there, and that often the job of the private sector has assumed for itself is to sit back and count on the governments to figure this out, when in fact, in many instances, whether it's major corporations or investors, have as much influence around US policy or frankly PRC policy as anybody. And so I guess what I would like to see in this space is for the private sector to step forward and play a much more significant role in terms of using that influence, talking to leaders in Beijing and saying, hey, we have these really important economic relationships. We think it's important that China is not engaging in activities that's going to destabilize the regional economy and the global economy. And that kind of echo and consensus from the business community, not just coming from the Pentagon and strategists in Washington, but coming from a broader set of voices in the business community to Beijing, I think could play an important role in shaping Beijing's approach to these issues. Well, I think the questions around redundancy and can companies exist in two different technology ecosystems or otherwise is going to be made on an individual firm level. But the question of the policy continuity around these issues, I think my perspective is we will see continuity in this space. I don't think it's going to evaporate back to an environment of not having to think through some of these risks and challenges. I think some of the questions, if we want to talk specifically about US policy, some of the questions, or maybe one of the most important questions from my perspective, is whether US policy is going to trend in a direction of onshoring and US independence and America first and autarky, or whether we're going to move toward a model of building secure supply chains among a community of trusted partners and allies. And I think that is still, even the folks who are making these arguments around the need for more controls, there hasn't been a consensus on that. I think there's strong arguments for thinking this through in an alliance context for a whole set of reasons. I would hope that's where US policy lands, but there are also very strong political waves pushing back in the other direction toward more of a America first, not friendshoring, but onshoring kinds of approach. So I think that's where the debates are going to happen. I don't think they're going to be around should we have export controls or not. Though, of course, the lines of those things are going to be constantly shifting. Look, I think the answer to that question is probably that there needs to be a fundamental understanding that the objective of US defense strategy in the region is around deterrence and the maintenance of openness. And I don't necessarily want to use the word status quo, because that status quo is always evolving. But the United States does not have sort of revisionist offensive aims in the Indo-Pacific. And so what the US is trying to do is to prevent opportunities, particularly from the PRC, to use its military and its aggression in the way that would be deeply destabilizing. And maybe there, I think, where is the private sector, underestimating or misconceiving of the environment? I think at least my personal perspective is, I feel like I have a relatively clear sense from my time in government of Beijing's ambitions and aspirations in the security realm, and the degree to which those are going to translate into economic and political realities for all sorts of stakeholders in the region if they're realized. So this isn't just a thing where Beijing has these very moderate, modest gains, despite some of its rhetoric around these issues. I think it has ambitions for regional dominance, and if realized, would have quite negative implications. And we ought to be all working collectively to maintain a more open region for economic benefit and for a lot of other reasons, rather than assuming that Beijing's largely benign in its rhetoric around community and win-win. I don't think that's the underlying reality, and I do think folks sometimes want to assume the best when we have a sense of the actual direction of PRC strategy pretty clearly. Obviously, the regional engagement there is important. All of the partners play their particular role. Among them, in the security realm, the Philippines is the most important as a treaty ally. Thailand is also an ally, but of a different kind. But the Philippines, in the context of U.S. defense strategy, fundamentally important. I think Vietnam remains a very important partner in terms of both the potential for the relationship in the future, the potential economic and technological relationship, and the degree to which there is alignment in certain respects. I don't want to overstate this, but in certain respects between the United States and Vietnam in terms of the management of the South China Sea issue and concerns about PRC dominance. Indonesia, obviously a very interesting, important country that has, I think, yet to fulfill its role, sort of punching at its weight on an international level or even a regional level. But I think that's something we could look toward in the future. So I think those are a few areas of important opportunity. And then, of course, Singapore, very important long-term economic and security partner of the United States. Well, I think the biggest current risk is neglect. And look, even as having worked in the Pentagon and had Southeast Asia in my portfolio, it's really far from Washington. It's hard to be out there all the time. It's complex. There's a lot of countries. It takes a lot of work to stay engaged with those partners. And the history and the geography and the territorial contestation is all quite complex. So it's a real commitment to play in that space. But I think it's really important. And what I worry about is if, including in part what we're seeing now from the Trump administration, if there's relatively less attention being played to Southeast Asia, it creates an opportunity for China to be growing its power and influence in a way that I think could catch up on the United States if it's not paying attention, and be a pathway for the PRC to develop much stronger political, institutional, economic, and potentially even military footholds throughout Southeast Asia in a way that has very negative implications for the United States in terms of access in its own partnership. So sometimes, the partners many of them are not as capable as our East Asian allies. Sometimes their economies are not necessarily as big, and the nature of the China challenge there sometimes is less immediate and severe. But the U.S.-China competition is as alive and well in Southeast Asia than anywhere. In some ways, it's the beating heart of the competition. And so this sort of policy of seeing it as a secondary, even sub-region of the Indo-Pacific, I think is a big mistake, and the U.S. has to stay engaged there.